So, history of science fiction, part two. What we've already covered is um, going all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the science fiction elements in mythology, and then into the Victorian and Edwardian era, where we're looking at advances in current technology, such as vivisection, actually, especially things like vivisection, because that shows up in Frankenstein, shows up in the Island of Dr. Moreau, even a few allusions to it in Dracula, things that we consider horror now. That's the science fiction of its day, and it's dealing with the burgeoning science of the times, right? So we have gotten up to the turn of the century, right? We talked about Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and they're two different approaches, right? H.G. Wells is more about humanity. Jules Verne is more about technology. And there's some overlap, obviously. Okay, so you don't need to spam the comments to tell me I'm so wrong about this long dead old man who you idolize. Because I realize it's not that simple. It's just simplified. Okay? But it's an important thing to keep in mind, because in a few decades we'll be getting to the split between technological and sociological science fiction, and that's an important split that's going on even today. But let's get back to where we are. Pulp science fiction, right? A lot of people think of pulp science fiction as like a 30s and 40s thing, but it really started at the turn of the century. And one of the probably most influential science fiction works, this is back when they were known as scientific romances, right? Think of the historical context that we've got going on at the time. We've got less influence from the church, rise of secular humanism, right? Industrial revolution. We've got more lay people getting into science. We've got, even though it was later shown to be an optical illusion, we've got publishing of things like the Canelli on Mars, right? People are starting to think of the planets as actual heavenly bodies. They exist, right? And they have surfaces. Those surfaces could contain things, right? All of that stuff is sort of melding together and creating an environment for fiction. And that's when we get something from Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, most famous for his work on Tarzan, and that's usually what he's known for. But in the science fiction community, especially people who've studied like the origins of sci-fi and the influences on science fiction, you'll know him as the author of the Barsoom series, and he also did the Pellucidar series, talking about beings on Venus, but famous for the Barsoom series, and it's incredibly influential. If you read it, go ahead and look up the first one. It's been published as a book, the Princess of Mars, right? It's about Dejah Thoris. She's a red-skinned Martian. Mars has multiple races, each one with their own ethnic identities, their own religion, their own mythology. It's an incredibly deep world for the time, because when you think about world building, which we've talked about before, in this era, when it came to stories, world building wasn't usually as deep, right? A lot of times, if you wanted a deep and complicated world, you set it in one that already existed. Usually our world, occasionally a world of existing mythology, right? So think about something like Sherlock Holmes. There's a lot of Sherlock Holmes lore, but anything that's not directly in the story really comes from modern day England, right? That's where it's being written. So with the Barsoom series, we've got it's bookended. So it starts off as a letter, right? Edgar Rice Burroughs is basically saying the hero of the story, John Carter, he's an old family friend. He's known him since he was a child. He's never seen him age a day. This manuscript was left to him by John Carter as an account of what happened to him. And then it gets into the story, right? So it's first-person perspective. It deals with a Civil War veteran. He's from the Confederate side. There's almost always a story reason for a Confederate veteran. We'll get into that a little later because there's a bunch of stories that I do want to talk about Confederate veterans in American fiction. Because there's, like I said, there's almost always a story reason and a character reason, and it's very specific that they are Confederate. There's a reason for it, right? As far as John Carter goes, all we need to know is basically he's a Southern gentleman, a warrior. He never remembers being a child. He's immortal, right? But he doesn't know all of this at the time. He is prospecting for gold after the war because he's a broken man. On the losing side of the war, he's gone out to seek a life. He finds himself trapped in a cave. He dies. He wakes up. He's on Mars, right? There he encountered, it's a long series, all right? And I want to give credit to my brother Andy Capellish. He gave us the greatest title for the series I think there's ever been, John Carter, the Deadbeat Dad of Mars. Because it really goes through his whole life and then the life of his children, and basically every book or two John Carter returns to Earth, and he's gone for a couple decades and then goes back to Mars. But it's incredibly influential, right? That is in many ways the basis for our modern science fiction as far as the adventure side of things like Star Wars and that. That really popularized science fiction reading in people's minds. And when we get into the 30s and 40s, we see the rise of comic book superheroes, right? Now, a lot of people like to take superhero fiction, graphic literature, all of that. They like to sort of separate it from sci-fi. In modern times, they've started growing back together, and I think that's a good thing, because really, they have their basis in science fiction. And a lot of people don't think about it too much, because, you've got Superman. That's a separate superhero thing. Capes and flight, right? You've got Batman, separate superhero thing. But when you think about the origins, right? Superman is an alien being. He's here to right injustices, social justices in particular. He's here to save the Earth using powers that he gains because he's an alien being. Batman, similar thing. Batman's taking on corruption and crime using the technology that he's able to advance. Technology that at the time either didn't exist or was very rare. And that continues today, right? Batman technologically advanced because he's a super genius. So they really do fit into sci-fi, and they're one of the things that helped keep sci-fi going even as the pulps kept going. We also get science fiction anthology magazines, which are super important to the history of sci-fi, because almost every sci-fi author that you love from the Golden Age, which we're about to get into, started off in these pulp magazines. You've got Heinlein, you've got Clarke, you've got Asimov, the three kings of science fiction, right? So it's right here where I want to talk about something called Sturgeon's Law. Sturgeon's Law is something that came up mainly as a defense of science fiction as art, right? Because this is something I've run into many times, especially when I was proposing to teach this course. So Sturgeon's Law states that 90% of all science fiction is just god-awful garbage. It's just trash. It's just, nothing. It's bad, right? If you've ever read a bunch of submitted fiction online, if you've ever written some of your own and then reflected on it, if you've ever read some of my science fiction, you can understand where that's coming from. 90% of it is just garbage. But there's an addition to Sturgeon's Law, right? It's not just that 90% of science fiction is bad. It's that 90% of all art that's created is also bad. And that's true. I mean, I have the advantage of being a teacher, which means I've read a lot of I've read a lot of creative writing, right? Not just from teenagers, but from children, from adults. I've done a lot of editing online. I've helped out people as a beta reader. I've sold my services as a copy editor. There's a lot of bad writing out there, and it's a craft, not necessarily a talent. You know, it's not something that you're just born with. It's something you develop, which means a lot of what gets written is just not good, right? So the whole idea of Sturgeon's law is that, yeah, 90% of science fiction is bad, but 90% of all art that's produced is bad. And so that 10% that's good, there's nothing that makes that any more or less valid than any other form of art, right? Sturgeon's law can be applied to really any genre that you want, really any type of art that you want. So that's something that we want to keep in mind, because right here in the 30s and 40s, as we start moving toward the golden age of science fiction, that's really where Sturgeon's law starts coming into effect, because you're going to look up stories from that time, you're going to look up those old pulp magazines, and you're going to find some just trash, but you're also going to find some real gems, and you're going to find some stuff from the kings and the influencers that really you can see their potential in there. But some of those early stories, you can see that they weren't quite there yet. All right. So now we're moving into the golden age, and this is where the real split comes. Like I talked about before, the difference between technical science fiction and sociological science fiction. This is a distinction I got from reading the letters of Robert Heinlein. Heinlein, after he died, his wife published a bunch of letters that he had written on the subject of science fiction and the subject of writing. Check them out at your local library if you get a chance. They are a pretty good insight into the man, but also really good just from a storytelling perspective. One of the interesting things about Heinlein is that for most of his career, Heinlein did not like to pretend he was making art. Heinlein was very upfront about things from the beginning. He said, I started writing because I had a mortgage to pay and people wanted to buy my work, right? And that's one of the things that he said throughout his life. To be a writer, you have to write, and then you have to sell what you've written. Otherwise, it's a hobby. If you want to be a writer, you got to sell. And if you want to sell, sometimes you have to bow to the pressures of your editor. One of the things that he was most famous for hating, as far as his own work goes, it's called The Sixth Column. A relatively racist story, even for the time it was written, in which the United States has been overrun by a Pan-Asian communist alliance, and the scientists of the rebellion are able to create a beam that only targets Asians and kills them, right? Heinlein made it very clear he basically wrote that because he was under contract to write it. He did not like the story, he didn't like the premise of the story, but he wrote it because that's what he was paid to do. And he tried to mitigate and undo the racism inherent in that plot as much as he could, but it's a racist plot to begin with. So Heinlein was writing about that. But what I was getting to was the difference between technical and sociological science fiction. The best example probably would be the difference between 2001, A Space Odyssey, and Star Trek. Okay? Now, a lot of Trekkies, and I don't use that term pejoratively. I myself, huge Star Trek fan. Love Star Trek. Star Trek has a lot to say about humanity and where we've been and where we could possibly go in the future. Okay? But Star Trek is not technically accurate. It never really has been. A lot of people, especially with 90s Trek, they like to talk about how there was like a scientific advisor and how Gene Roddenberry was always about what could be done in the future, and he wanted that incorporated into the stories. That's bunk. All right? Here's the real deal with Star Trek. Star Trek is what's called sociological science fiction, which means it's a story about humanity. It's a story about where we are going It's a story about where we are and how we can be better or how we can be worse, right? That's what Star Trek's about. Technology is window dressing. Technology is just a method for telling those stories, right? So, for example, you can take almost any Star Trek plot, right? Any of the good ones, the plots that the series is known for, right? You take any of those Star Trek plots and you change it to a fantasy story, it's going to work almost every time, right? Because the story is about the characters and the society in which they live or the society that they encounter, right? That's sociological science fiction. 2001, on the other hand, 2001 has a lot to say about us as people. But at the same time, 2001 is focused on the technology that we have, right? And that technology bridging us into that possible future, right? So yes, we can be better, but here's how technology is going to get us there, right? And that's the big difference. That split really starts around the 1950s. That's when we start getting what is often referred to as hard sci-fi. Hard sci-fi, you'll think of things like Rendezvous with Rama, right? Everything in that is based on what was scientifically possible at the time, what we knew about science. You think about things like The Expanse, right? That's a trilogy. If you're not aware, it was made into a sci-fi show. Now it's on Amazon. Very good series to read. Very good series to watch. It's excellent. Check it out if you get the chance. The thing about the Expanse series, though, the author put a lot of work into how things work in the future. So he doesn't just say there are colonies on the asteroids in the asteroid belt. He instead talks about how the people of the asteroid belt, because they're separated from society for months, years at a time, their language has evolved, their bodies have started adjusting to the gravity in different ways. So like they look different than our average human. They have different shaped limbs. None of this is the result of genetic engineering. It's just living in that low gravity environment in isolation, right? It makes sense. He's taken all of that into account. So that's the big differences you want to look at between the two. Does the technology serve as the focus of the story, or is the technology just something to push along the main thrust of the sociological point of the story, right? That brings us into the Golden Age. The Golden Age is the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, when basically science fiction was everywhere, right? Popular science was starting to get everywhere. We had things like the space race, right? Putting it in the front of human consciousness. We had foreign science fiction starting to take over. We've got things like Soviet Union producing a bunch of sci-fi. Check all that out if you ever get the chance. It's fascinating reading. Where Soviet authors thought communism was going to be in the future, where they thought the world was going to be in relation to the Soviet Union in the future, and how Soviet political theories would be applied to future societies. Fascinating reading. And that'll bring us to the end of today's video. We're going to get into part 3, where we get into more modern science fiction, starting in the mid-70s, when things take a change toward adventure. And there's still a lot of politics, social justice, everything that we find in that Golden Age sci-fi, but the window dressing has changed. And that's going to be a real interesting conversation. So I look forward to that in the next video. I want to thank everyone who has watched today, and who has watched any of my past videos. I want you guys to have a great day, and I will talk to you a little later this week. Be sure to check out the links that I have posted down below here on the YouTube. If you're interested in anything I have to say, go ahead and hit subscribe. Get that bell notification icon. That way you'll be informed every time I post a new video. And share with your friends if you think they might like it. If you're here on the Facebook, I've always got a few links up on Facebook to my fellow artists and the art that they create. Go ahead and support them. A lot of them are doing great work, and I always like supporting my people. So like I said before, you guys have a great time. I will see you later. Bye.